Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our podcast, which is a lunch and learn session today on why governance is key for PMO success. We often talk about governance assurance in relation to projects and why it's important to project success. Today, I want to talk about why it's actually required for PMO success. So hopefully of interest to us all. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Eileen Rowden. I'm one of the co-founders of PMO Learning. You might recognise me as the P3 author and also lead author of the PMO competence framework. So again, I had lots of experience of actually kind of running and managing PMOs before moving over to the other side of the fence and now helping other people to do so. In terms of PMO Learning, if this is your first session with us, let me just tell you a little bit about PMO Learning. We are a niche training provider who specializes in PMO training. So for those people who work in the PMO or connected to the PMO, want to get more out of the PMO, we have a very interactive approach to training delivery, make sure all of our delegates get very involved in the process to make sure the learning kind of really sticks, making sure they're not only covering theory, but some kind of real practical advice to how you can use that back in practice. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is that any of the trainers that you come into touch with were from PMO Learning, that actually they'll have real PMO management or real PMO experience. So a lot of our trainers are still actually in full-time employment, working in PMOs, and they just take some time off during their busy schedule to deliver training for PMO Learning. In terms of what we offer, we have a number of certification courses and non-certification courses, but actually we can kind of develop what's required for your organization. So whether they be kind of straight vanilla courses as a one person attending a public schedule or coming to actually deal with a whole cohort in your organization, we can do some slight tailoring, or we can develop something completely bespoke for your organization. And rather than just kind of giving it to you and throwing it, we do provide some additional support. We don't do consultancy, but what we do is coaching, either for kind of the people who are involved in implementing and embedding the processes in the organization, or on a one-to-one basis for those people who are managing or working in PMOs. So as I said, today's session is about exploring the importance of governance for success of PMO. And I will touch on the 10 principles that are covered in the P3G certification that we deliver here at PMO Learning. So during the session, I'll be using two key references. The first one is the PMO competence framework. Hopefully you're all aware of this, but if you're not, this is a competence framework that was published by the House of PMO, talks through the specific competencies to be an effective PMO professional. And within the PMO competence framework, there is a competence called governance frameworks, which requires you to be able to create and sustain a governance model for the delivery of projects, programs, and portfolios aligned with the organization's established governance practices. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those established governance practices and why they're perhaps a little different from those that what we look at in projects, programs, and portfolios. The second text that I'm going to reference is the P3G publication. Now, this was published last year back in 2023. One of a really good piece of practical as well as kind of theoretical side of governance around projects, programs, and portfolios, and which is the basis for our P3G certification course. So we're going to refer to those, and as I said, we'll come on a little bit later in terms of how they mix with corporate governance. So first things first, what actually is governance? What is corporate governance? So one of the definitions, and believe me, there are a few, is the system of rules, practices, and processes by which an organization is directed and controlled. Now, I just want to, if you think about starting your own business and look at some of the kind of the very big organizations that are out there, any organization that starts up tends to be organized around what that business is about. It's about, how do we recruit people into the organization? How do we purchase things from our suppliers? How do we deliver services to our customers, sell goods to our customers, pay our staff, record the sales, and make that whole thing work together? So we are either, if we're a commercial entity, so we're profitable. If we're in the public sector, how do we make sure we're delivering what we're expected to deliver with the people and the resources that we've got made available to us? So typically when any kind of, even at a department level, department, division, organization is created, the systems, processes and practices that are set up are all about being able to kind of run the business. Now, some of the things that we might think about in terms of corporate governance, the first things first is having some kind of organization chart. Who's going to be working in the organization? How are we going to split that up into kind of different departments? Who's going to be reporting into who? How's that all going to kind of work on a ongoing basis to ensure that we're delivering what we need to deliver to our customers, to our suppliers, to our staff in a repeatable, efficient and economic manner? So we put that organization structure in place. And we often have to have some kind of, as I said, some rules and regulations that go around that. Now, certainly here in the UK and in other parts of the world, that is very often, a lot of that starts off with some definitions from a legal requirement. So in organizations, I'll go for here in the UK, there are some very defined roles and responsibilities of being a director. So if you're going to be a director, you are held accountable for things like health and safety and also financial irregularities, which is where those kind of financial regulations come into. We have to be very kind of open and transparent to not just to the kind of the tax man, but also to kind of the wider registration of our business to make sure that we're not doing anything illegal or verging on illegal from a financial perspective. There are lots of other laws and policies, government policies, that we have to adhere to. So put in there kind of bribery and corruption. So we're not allowed to take big gifts without kind of going through the normal channels. And also in terms of employment law, there are certain things we have to do with our staff in terms of pay them a minimum wage, make sure they're allowed some holiday, covering off things like maternity, but also in terms of kind of what we can get them to do and the environment we can ask them to work in. So some of our rules and regulations are actually, kind of, as I said, set by our local government. Some of those other elements, though, are actually down to how our organisations want to work. So we can decide on, for example, what our recruitment policy is. We can decide on whether we're going to go through an agency, whether we're going to go direct through to individuals. We're going to put adverts in the local newspaper. We're going to decide on what the kind of, how many interviews they need to go through, when we're going to use AI and online interviews before we kind of get them in place. We can decide on our expenses policy, kind of, are we going to allow our staff to stay in 5-star hotels? Are we going to limit them to kind of cheap bed and breakfasts to a particular amount? What can they claim? All of those things, that's our decision in an organization, whether we want to do that. So do we allow people to go on social media? What are the limitations of what they can put there? And we can pull together job descriptions in kind of weird and wonderful, and we've seen some really fantastic job titles over the years, but we can put together that job title and job description to decide on, what is it people are going to do when they work in our organization. And so typically when we're setting up our organization, the owners of the organization, or the kind of the managers of the organization, will decide on how the business is going to work, how the organization is going to function, what people need to know in order for that to happen on a regular basis. Now, the interesting thing is we could have absolutely fantastic corporate governance and run the business particularly well, but it doesn't necessarily translate to effective corporate governance. So setting up projects and programs and portfolios sometimes don't sit comfortably within those elements of corporate governance. So let me just kind of give you a couple of examples. So in our organization structure, we sit in our teams, report to our managers, who then report up to their managers. Typically, when we're having a project, We are going to pull together people from all across the organization and sit them under a project manager. We're already breaking the organizational structure that's been set up to run the business. There are other elements we also need to think about in terms of decision making, in terms of scope and finance, where actually the corporate governance may not be suited to that environment. So on a project, program, and portfolio, we have to start thinking about what kind of governance do we need to put in place that supplements corporate governance. And this is the interesting bit because it doesn't override it. We have to develop that P3M governance to sit alongside and to integrate fully with corporate governance. So we very well may need to update and change corporate governance to get two elements of governance to sit closely together. So in order for effective delivery of projects and programs, and this is what we call the governance triangle, we need to start thinking about, well, actually, when we're doing kind of portfolios, programs, and projects, we need to think differently than our normal organization structure, some of our normal policies and procedures. Now, what we can't do is do things that are against the kind of legislation for working in an organization. And what we shouldn't do, we've already got the challenge of maintaining corporate governance to make sure that's all aligned and we've got no kind of disconnects and gaps. And what we can't be doing is kind of bringing in a whole load of new governance that kind of clashes with or kind of changes, or not changes, but kind of is against some of the governance, the kind of the governance that they from a run the business perspective. And so we need to think very carefully about what is this kind of, what do we need to put in place in order to have effective governance about projects, programs, and portfolios, and why is that different to what we would have from a corporate perspective? So when we talk about P3G, which is kind of project, program, and portfolio governance, what we're talking about here is about how we choose to direct and oversee the investment. So if we think of our business as usual kind of corporate governance, this is all about kind of how do we kind of manage the funds around the business to kind of run that business as usual, buy suppliers, pay our staff, and get income from the our end customers. At a portfolio level, what we're thinking about here is, well, actually, we're not buying supplies. We're actually creating an investment portfolio. We're going to be investing in change. So I do kind of pull some people up sometimes when we talk about project spend, because we lose something when we forget that it's actually an investment and we're trying to get a return on it. But how do we decide on who makes that investment, and how do we ensure we kind of manage that investment to make sure we do get a return on that? What are the processes we need to have in place that individuals and essentially governance bodies, so whether that be a project board, a program board, the investment board, progress board, whatever kind of the boards do we need to have in place, and how do we actually kind of hold them accountable and to deliver the changes that they have invested the money in? Now, as we've already identified, typically, if it's a private company, there's kind of annual accounts and shareholders meetings. If it's a public sector organization, then interestingly, you're held account every time there's a ballot, but we also have kind of reporting requirements to central government in terms of how that money has been spent. And it's very clear how, kind of who is involved in that. When we start thinking about projects, programs, and portfolios, we have to start thinking about not just about being, kind of writing some of those job descriptions, but thinking about what are the processes that need to be in place to hold those people to account on a regular basis. And I I always kind of find it interesting when I go into organizations who have all of the kind of the stuff documented on how we're going to do projects and programs. And I say, well, but how do you actually kind of hold a sponsor to account? What's the mechanism in your organization for holding a project board to account? Just giving them a kind of a terms of reference isn't sufficient. There needs to be some other processes in place to actually kind of hold them into account. And we also need to make sure that those people in who are holding those roles around projects, programs, and the portfolio and sit on those governance body have the right information to ensure that they're making kind of evidence-based decisions that are both effective and efficient. So again, kind of what do we need to have in place to ensure that we recognize the impact of those decisions, and further on down the line, we recognize whether they've been good or bad and do kind of the organizational learning beyond that. So when we're setting up P3 governance, there is quite a bit for us to think about. So first of all, we need to start thinking about, well, who are those kind of governance bodies? What is it we actually kind of need to have in place? So again, do we do projects and programs in our organizations? Do we just do projects? At what level does a project sponsor need to kind of go up to the executive board in terms of overspend? Do we have the right processes in place in order to kind of make decisions? And again, one of the things we often see is that there's escalation up to a governance body, to a project or a program board, but we have very little when it comes back to actually kind of to make sure that everything has actually kind of been actioned, and we've got some body accountable for the actions that have taken place or are going to take place based on the decisions that have been taken. The other thing we need to make sure of is that we've got people who are competent in the roles and have got clear roles and responsibilities. You would never think about getting a company accountant who didn't have the right qualifications and the right experience in accounts. You would look for some formal qualifications, you might look for some experience, or you would make sure you had a kind of a training plan in place. And this is a really kind of interesting move for kind of a lot of organizations. Very often the people who deliver some of our projects and our programs, they've been a good line manager and they've got some good organization skills, but potentially they haven't got the right kind of skills, experience, and knowledge in order to be able to manage a complex project or program. Now, we're not saying that they haven't got the aptitude to learn that and to develop that capability, but very often we give projects and programs to people who really are kind of really struggling to know where to start because they don't have the right kind of skills and capability on the outset of that project. Some of the other people we also need to think about in terms of kind of putting those roles in place is the senior managers. And this can be really difficult. When we're starting to think about kind of portfolio level, portfolio management, when we're talking about being a program sponsor, senior responsible officer of something that's large and complex, again, often the person who's been elected or selected for that role has been a great line manager, runs a fantastic department, but may not have the skills and capabilities to actually, or even know the role of a project or program sponsor, what's expected of them. And so often there's quite a big education process to get that kind of governance in place, and having some clear accountabilities and responsibilities. And again, I haven't done an awful lot of work in organizations with sponsors. What I found really interesting is that in the kind of the project management world, in the kind of the delivery frameworks, it says quite clearly sponsors will do this, 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 and this. Individuals, kind of senior managers' job descriptions only ever talk about the operational business as usual role. And it'd been interesting working with some organizations to update operational line managers' role to say, as part of your business as usual role, you will be expected at times to step up to the role of sponsor, which will also require to have you these kind of other kind of skills and knowledge. So really interesting in terms of some of the ways we can kind of embed that into organizations. We also need to make sure that the standard management information, which is around from the kind of the accounts department, perhaps the HR department and operations, also now takes a project program and portfolio view. When we were developing the competence framework, we did identify that every PMO that we came across did an element of reporting. But often those project reports, those program reports don't flow in the same way as standard organization management information. And we need to get into a position where we recognize that actually the project management systems and processes are as mission critical as our business as usual processes and procedures, because of the amount of money and resources that are tied up in our portfolio of investment, but also in terms of the future of the organization is predicated on the successful delivery of that portfolio of change in order to deliver the strategy for the organization. So in terms of kind of switching governance on, there's quite a lot to be done. And there are some kind of critical success factors to make sure that what we're putting in place is both effective and efficient. So again, about making sure there are no gaps or overlaps. Now, I think this kind of takes on two dimensions. Firstly, we have to make sure there's no gaps or overlaps with the governance of projects and programs. We also need to worry about gaps and overlaps with the governance, the corporate governance. So let me just kind of give you a couple of examples of where we might kind of hit some of the challenges for that. In terms of where there might be a gap, is where we have got recruitment on a business as usual, absolutely sorted. HR department have got that. We then define some recruitment processes that we want to use when we're populating projects and programs. But what we haven't thought about, if we've got, we don't do some careful thinking about what happens at the end of those projects and programs, particularly if it's a long program where as far as kind of some of the legal requirements are, that person is then entitled to be a treat like a permanent employee if they've been in the organization for a particular length of time. What happens at the end? Do they have a go back to the department that kind of they're representing on the project, or do we have to go through a kind of full redundancy program? So often, kind of having to kind of marry those processes up. The other chance, some of the difficulties we have is where there are overlaps. And when I say overlaps, often that comes across as some potential conflict. And it's just kind of some of the simple things in terms of, from a reporting perspective, from a business as usual perspective, when we set up our payroll systems, when we set up our finance systems, when we talk about month end, we mean month end. We mean the 31st of the month or the 30th of the month, or good old February this year, the 29th of the month. Yes, we have all of those kind of end of year, end of month processes in place. We have end of year processes in place, which is kind of aligned to the tax year. So kind of typically 31st of March. When we're setting up our project management processes and our portfolio processes, there's no point in deciding, though some organizations do actually, when we talk about projects, we want month end to be the last Friday in the month, because then we can kind of go, kind of easily in terms of dealing with weeks from a project perspective. Oh, that fits nicely with kind of weekly reporting. So actually, we're going to call our month end the last Friday in every month. And all of a sudden, you've got a mismatch now between the reporting that you get from your finance system and the reporting you get from projects. And it becomes very difficult for people to actually kind of recognize the alignment between those two if we kind of don't actually kind of do that for them. I think the other thing is as well, in terms of approvals and recognizing it's not just processes, but it's also systems there in terms of an overlap. in terms of, again, working with an organization where their procurement process was embedded in their purchase order system. So I could raise a purchase order and that would be signed off by my line manager. Seems perfectly feasible. However, if I end up being a project manager and say I'm working for Cheryl, lovely Cheryl, we've got like nice to have your face on, and I'm working for Cheryl. Cheryl's my project sponsor. If I raise a purchase order for the project, it shouldn't be my line manager who signs that off. It should be the project sponsor, and they recognise that actually their corporate governance around their procurement processes were completely misaligned with the project processes, procurement processes. So quite a bit to kind of get your kind of head round in terms of the gaps and overlap. And again, we're very much about kind of developing role profiles for a project. So whether that be a project manager, whether that be a kind of a terms of reference or a project sponsor. The idea is we don't kind of just write a job description for Eileen, who's going to be the project manager, because we know who Eileen is and what kind of skills she's got. We need to be very clear, kind of following our best practice or kind of local best practice, what works in our organization. And we need to make sure that kind of anybody who kind of steps up to the role of project manager or to the role of the sponsor is actually kind of defined by that. And again, we've talked about, kind of some of our formal business as usual documentation is very much aligned to specific templates, again, because we need kind of very much kind of specific information. A lot of the systems are predicated on having not just kind of printing facilities, but actually kind of production of key documents that are going to be made available to kind of externally and need to be validated and verified by external bodies. And again, very often we see project and program governance producing reports that are based on the kind of the proverbial back of a fag packet, because it's not seen to have the same gravitas or import as some of the other management information around business as usual. So P3 governance is really kind of can be as complex and as difficult to put in place as corporate governance. There's very kind of little other than the kind of the standard corporate governance that kind of is applied to kind of how we want to set projects and programs up. And it's really about kind of getting an understanding of best management practice that sits out there in the outside world. And there is an awful lot out there in terms of kind of understanding what's there, but actually thinking about what best fits with our organization. So what is the role and what's covered in the role of the PMO, and why are we kind of so interested in all of this? And I think the first thing to recognize is that actually establishing P3M governance around projects, programs, and portfolios sits very squarely with the PMO. So typically I was going to say typically a portfolio office, and it's really interesting. Kind of some of the people we see, particularly on our we've got a course called kind of setting up a PMO, which is really about setting up your first PMO. It always kind of surprises us about who's been asked to set up a PMO in the first place. Who is it who's asked to kind of provide some standard processes and procedures around projects? It very often doesn't start with programs. It's around some kind of standard processes around projects and standard processes around kind of portfolio management. So how an organization sees all of their kind of the different kind of projects and program and oversees that investment. And I think it's important to recognize that in order for that to be really effective, it isn't just a case of drawing up kind of some procedures and kind of some terms of reference, because to be fair, you can grab that off the internet, you can get AI to develop some of those for you. The real kind of challenge of establishing that P3M governance is making sure that we've won the hearts and the minds and the commitment of the people kind of in senior positions who are actually kind of going to make sure that that's upheld. So when we're talking about establishing P3M governance, we're talking about embedding that in the organization. So again, having worked with an organization where kind of reports have been produced that have demonstrated that kind of governance isn't working or kind of sponsors aren't doing their role. And actually, it kind of almost kind of falls on deaf ears. We've put in place some processes to determine that actually it's the investment board who need to approve any project before people start working on the project. We have resources allocated to that project, and which is kind of fine as long as everybody agrees with that. As soon as we've got a kind of a difficult conversation, again, worked with an organization, as soon as there was a difficult conversation, yes, all of a sudden the authority of the investment board was completely challenged and actually was overridden. And you've got to say, well, actually, there's no point in having kind of a fair weather investment board that is only there approving the projects that kind of are really no-brainers for the organization. You really need that investment board to have the power, the authority, to have teeth, that kind of when a project comes up, that even if everybody thinks it's a kind of a great idea, but the business case just doesn't stack up, and we're not going to have the resources to deliver, and actually it clashes with three others. We need the governance structures to be able to have some real bite and actually prevent that project starting, or make some decisions around some of the other projects to make sure we end up with a kind of a balanced portfolio. And again, I say a lot of PMOs, and speaking to kind of the PMO manager, we start asking about kind of how strong that governance structure is and whether it has teeth. And we often get, oh yes, senior management agree with everything we're doing. And I kind of think, well, it's great that they agree, but do they actively support and enforce some of the processes that are being put in place? So it's great as long as it's all kind of over there and it kind of doesn't impact me. As soon as you've kind of working with kind of the senior directors and they're saying, well, actually, all of the projects, even your kind of pet projects, need to go through the same process and the same challenge. They've really got to be committed to the governance structures that have got in place. So very often we find that, kind of the PMO are asked to deliver something without the senior managers, a lot of the time actually recognizing what's involved in that. So very much kind of a hearts and mind process. So understanding kind of how to go about what approach that needs to be taken, and all of the kind of the soft skills that are associated with establishing P3M governance is a really important set of skills that's required by the PMO. And I've already kind of touched on this. And everywhere, kind of all of the PMO do reporting, but that reporting should completely underpin the governance structure that's been set up. So we need to be very clear about who's fulfilling what roles, what decisions each individual and governance body can make, so we can provide them with up-to-date and timely information. And we make sure that, kind of there's suitable challenge to make sure that the decisions are made. And more importantly, I find that those decisions are recorded and drive action. I did some assurance for an organisation, and I identified that the terms of reference that had been written for a particular governance body basically give them the authority to talk a lot. Yes. So they would review, it was written there in the terms of reference, they'll review these reports, they'll read these reports, but actually there was nothing in there in terms of kind of what decisions they were allowed to make, whether it was quorate, kind of how many people had to be there, whether you could have a meeting, kind of early in the morning to kind of avoid having some people around at the meeting. There's all sorts of kind of tactics to get around that unless you've got good kind of terms of reference. So we need to kind of make sure we have the information available to support that decision making. And also kind of the other side of governance is assurance. So from a PMO perspective, and we, again, there is a challenge in terms of how we do this independently, particularly we've been kind of setting up some of this governance, is recognize how do we look at the governance structure that's put in place. How do we recognize, or how do we assess whether that governance is both effective and efficient? So how do we see that the decisions that are being made are being made? How do we know that those decisions then follow through to actions? And can we do an assessment at the end of the project or delivery of the program and delivery of those benefits to say that actually the governance structure around that particular project or around that particular program was effective? Which kind of brings in kind of almost kind of that kind of third dimension that says actually it's not just about the role of the project manager and the program manager. The governance structure around P3M has to include the roles and responsibility of the PMO itself. So what is it that we have the authority to do in the organization? What information, what data have we got access to? And what is our role when it comes to supporting the delivery of projects and programs, but also being that critical friend and challenging where decisions have been made, where people have been put in place who perhaps haven't got the right kind of skills and capability, where that information we believe is not really representative of the current state of the project and program, or where we believe, kind of things are being misrepresented or decisions are not being made in the right way. So our role itself has to be established when we're setting up the governance of P3M in an organization. So without this, without the kind of the correct governance structure being set up, it becomes very difficult to be able to do our role. And let me just kind of give you a very kind of straightforward example of kind of ensuring the roles have been defined correctly. So if we think about our monthly reporting pack, and every month the senior management team want a report of how all of the projects are together. So I've gone to Panita. Sorry, Panita, you're my lovely face that I can see at the top of my list. And I've gone to Panita 3 times. I've asked Panita for her project information. And to be fair to Panita, she's having a really difficult time. It's a massively strong project, massively complex projects. But at the end of the week, Panita hasn't provided her project information to me as the PMO. I then present that information to senior managers and they go, hold on a minute, there's a project missing over here. And I'll say, oh, yes, that's Panita's project. So interesting in terms of where does accountability sit for actually kind of providing that information? Is that accountability with Panita to provide it to me? Because actually my role in the PMO is to collate the information that I've been given. Yes, I can spend an awful lot of time and effort in the PMO chasing every project manager 20 times, and we've all done it. How many people have spent chasing timesheets on a Friday afternoon, or even worse, on a Monday morning? Clear roles and responsibilities said it's not our job. It's our job to collate the information we get. It's the project manager's job to send all of that information. It's an individual person's job to complete their timesheet. And therefore, they should be held accountable rather than the PMO, who kind of often goes with a target on their head that says, kind of, shoot me, but I'm only the messenger. Yes? So interesting in terms of if we want to really do a good job at kind of analyzing that information, providing not just kind of reporting, but insights, we need to be very clear where accountability is for providing us that information in order to do it. So I do think it's kind of really interesting that we often talk about kind of governance and kind of how we do projects and programs, but actually it's a massive enabler for us to kind of spend our time effectively analyzing that information rather than actually kind of spending all of our time chasing people to actually kind of fill the documentation in. I remember a while ago we did have a session and we talked about how we could use kind of some of the new tools and technologies to help with things like kind of timesheet collection. We did talk about having a floor plan and programming a drone that it would go and kind of hover over people's heads who hadn't filled in their timesheet. You see, so you could marry up kind of your seating plan and your project reporting system to kind of go and harass people. But that's not what we want to do. But I think, as I said, I do think it's important that actually we can be more effective in the PMO if the roles and responsibilities, even around things like kind of data collection access, is properly defined in the governance structure. So last year, the book was published on principles of efficient and effective P3G, and subsequently there's been a certification course, a 2-day certification course that's been set up to actually kind of go through these 10 principles. Now, these 10 principles we'll talk about, they'll not say kind of this is the exact job description you must have, but what it will say is kind of when you look across best management practice of projects and programs, when you're thinking about what you're going to do in your organization, these are 10 underlying principles that you have to have in place. And if you've got these 10 principles in place, then actually you've got a good chance that what you've got in place is an effective and efficient governance structures. Obviously, there's kind of the work to do involved in doing that. But one of the kind of the beauties of the text, and one of the reasons why, you know, you might want to do the course with PMO Learning is because we take that a specific approach to kind of from a PMO perspective about how to implement that. So this is just to answer kind of Nicole's question there. This is the P3G textbook. This is where this comes from, these kind of 10 principles. So first principle we've already talked about in terms of just recognizing that if we're going to do projects and programs, we do need to take a slightly different approach, or we have to take a different approach to how we do our business as usual. We can't apply the same things because we have different organized, you know, kind of as the minimum, we have different organization structures for the delivery of projects and programs. Again, as you typically have a single person, a kind of a departmental head, so you've got that single point of accountability. The second principle talks about making sure we have a single point of accountability for each project and program. And again, I think this is kind of hugely important for us in the PMO about recognizing that even though we have the project management processes in place, that actually it's the project manager and the project sponsor that is responsible for each individual project and program and its success. And again, very often kind of the PMO get caught in the kind of the crossfires or expected to go and kind of take over a project without necessarily recognizing the accountability of the project manager or the kind of the project sponsor. Third principle is about making sure we align project governance and the outcomes of those projects to who's going to be impacted in the business. So if we're going to do an increase of sales, then actually it would seem sensible that the person who is actually kind of going to be the sponsor for that is the sales manager or sales director. So kind of this is where we have alignment with what the projects are delivering versus how that's going to impact our business as usual. Fourth principle is about making sure we have the right level project or programs governance in board, about looking at kind of what that means and what their role is. As I said, what we don't want is just a kind of professional meeting attenders. Again, we often find this when we set up a project and program board. We have a set of professional meeting attenders who talk a lot, who pass opinions, but don't necessarily have some real accountability. And again, you know, kind of some of the things we talk about is kind of we often have introduced when you get signed up to a governance board, project board, you know, it's very nice just to receive a letter and say, by the way, congratulations, Hayley, you're now on the project board. Please, can you sign this document to say you acknowledge your responsibilities and accountabilities, and you will be kind of living up to that. And it's really interesting. There's a very kind of different approach when you get people to actually say, oh, hold on a minute, it isn't just attending meetings once a week or kind of once a month. I've actually got a role to play, and actually the success of the project is dependent on the role that I play within that project or program governance board. And interestingly, what we also want to do from a senior manager's perspective is recognise as well that kind of senior managers have a role to play, particularly around effective decision making and making sure there's kind of ongoing guidance to the project and program managers, particularly where we've got kind of assumptions or change happening. So the fifth principle is about making sure that we recognize who the key decision makers are, and that doesn't necessarily mean the key stakeholders. Yes, so we often are aware of our RACI, where there's a difference between consulted and informed. And I always give the example of my children who all have cars of their own now, but recognize, kind of recognize that actually if I'm getting a new car, they like to give me their opinion. Yes, so they might be a stakeholder because they might sit in the car, but I don't need to kind of get their approval or agreement to the kind of car that I want to drive now. Yes, so yes, they might be stakeholders, but they're not part of the decision-making process. And again, just making that clear across the organization can sometimes be some difficult messaging. Principle 6 is about making sure that we have alignment to the strategic objectives. And again, this can be an interesting one in terms of kind of making sure that people don't have access to resources, whether that be people or money, and invest their time doing projects that don't align to the organizational strategy. So again, we need to have some bite to make sure that that happens. Principle 7 is about maintaining the business case. So there has to be checks and balances throughout the life of the project. And I would argue past the life of the project through benefits realization to make sure we continuously go back to why we were investing in the project and what has changed in order to make it effective. Principle 8 is about making sure that that governance is about driving investment outcomes. And again, we see in lots of organizations where focus is purely around project and output delivery. It's not about driving outcomes and benefits for the organization. So that governance structure, particularly in terms of holding sponsors to account post-project delivery, is very weak in some organizations. So principle 9 is about making sure we've got consistent and logical decision making rates. So establishing particularly kind of escalation processes and making sure they're in place long before they're actually needed. And also people recognize where decisions are going to be made. If people, the worst thing we find is that people don't know who gets to make the decision and spend their time arguing about who gets to make the decision. Well, actually, what we need is the speed in decision making. So make sure we've got that all kind of established up front. And then the final principle, which is about enabling evidence-based investment decision making. So again, about that's making sure we spend time and have the right processes in place, not just from a decision making, but understanding the provenance of some of the information that actually has to get to the individuals who are making those decisions, and making sure it's presented and interpreted in a way that is useful and digestible for the people who are making those decisions. Now, I've just kind of rattled through the principles because I wanted you to kind of understand what those kind of principles were. And as I said, to me, they're really kind of the beauty of the textbook. It talks about not just in terms of kind of what those principles are, but actually we'll discuss some of the challenges of implementing those principles. And coming on a course where you've got other people in similar situations, you may find, well, actually, in my organizations, I've sussed principles 4, 5, and 6. That's all sorted. What I'm really struggling for is principles 7 and 8. So again, being able to kind of share some of those tactics and kind of discuss some of those tactics with other people who are sitting in PMOs around the organization is really helpful. And just to kind of pick up on that point, if you do attend the P3G governance course, it does come, the textbook is covered from a PMO learning perspective. We also provide the textbook as part of our materials. You will also get a printed workbook, a hard copy of the workbook we send out to delegates prior to the course, so you can kind of take further notes as you go through the course. So a quick whistle stop tour of governance. Hopefully that's kind of made sense in terms of kind of why you need P3G governance, P3G, not just corporate governance, why it's important from a PMO perspective in terms of our particular success, but our success also when helping the organisation, and then a quick introduction to the 10 principles from the textbook that is covered in the certification course. So, last few minutes. Any last questions anybody wants to put in chat, or anybody wants to come off chat and speak out loud? Nobody dare. Don't worry about that. If you have got any questions, I'm going to put our contact details up. We do have a public course coming up. There's our courses, our next few courses that are coming up oh, let's go the right way, Eileen. The courses that are coming up in the next few weeks through March and April. Our next P3G certification course is running on the 25th and the 26th of April. And if you quickly jot down the code P3G15, you apply that when you make a purchase off the website, it will magically deduce 15% of the cost, and so you'll get a discount because you attended this presentation at lunchtime. Okay, so if anybody wants to attend the course, if you want to discuss it further, do get in touch. You can phone us and speak to somebody direct. We do answer the phones, or there's an email address. You can contact us there, or you can go and find some more details on our website about the course, the content, or any of the courses that you might find useful to you and your team. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.